Walker, you and I have been through rough times, and we spent the last couple of letters talking about why rough times demand resilience. Now I want to talk about something bigger and even more important. You need resilience not just for the hard times. You need resilience if you're going to be happy. So let's talk about a funny thing. You ask most people, do you want to be happy? They say, yes. Then you ask, what does it mean to be happy? And you get blank stares. You get some umming and ahhing. Now, not everything that is good, useful, or beautiful can be defined. Can you define jazz, or ballet, or painting? I certainly can't. So we shouldn't be surprised that we can't come up with a set of words to describe the art of living. But happy is a word we throw around a lot. The pursuit of happiness is etched into the American mind right there next to life and liberty. And if we're going to aim for something, work for something, then it might do us good to spend some time thinking about what we're aiming at. And before we start, I want to be clear, Walker, I want you to be happy. Are you? Are you happy? It's a question you probably ask yourself. I know it's a question you ask your wife. It's a question she probably asks you. But is it the right question? What does it really mean to be happy? And while this is true of everything that I write to you, it's particularly true of what I'm going to write about happiness. I don't have the answer. And no one but you will have your answer. The guys you liked hearing from before, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Aristotle, had an interesting way of talking about happiness. Broadly speaking, in the Greek world, to live well meant to live a flourishing life. What does it mean to flourish? You were a logger. You know trees. And it's obvious to you when a tree is flourishing. Provided the right soil, water, and sun, a flourishing tree grows tall and strong. Its branches spread, its trunk grows thicker, its leaves come in green in the spring, and it produces seeds and sap and deep roots. You also know when a tree is suffering. You know when it's dead or when it's close to dying. You don't need to ask the tree how it feels. You look at the tree and you know these things. The tree is flourishing or it's not. Flourishing is a fact, not a feeling. We flourish when we grow and thrive. We flourish when we exercise our powers. We flourish when we become what we are capable of becoming. Of course, people are more complex than trees, and it can be more difficult to tell when a person is flourishing. But it's not impossible, in fact, the basic idea is the same. As Edith Hamilton put it, the Greeks often thought of flourishing as the exercise of vital powers along lines of excellence in a life affording them scope. Let's look at this idea in some detail. You exercise your vital powers. Flourishing is rooted in action. That action might be meditation. It might be cooking a meal or teaching a class. It might be putting your daughter to sleep. But flourishing isn't abstract. It's a product of what we do. You exercise vital powers. Vital to you. Vital to the world. You draw from your strengths to do worthy work in the world. You work along lines of excellence. You don't just do things. You do them well. Aristotle, who did more than any other thinker to develop our ideas of human flourishing, said that happiness is a kind of working of the soul in the way of perfect excellence. It might be quality cooking, quality saxophone playing, or quality lovemaking. A flourishing life is a life lived along lines of excellence. The Greeks recognized that true flourishing is not always within our control. The tree needs good soil and good sun. People need a life that affords them scope. Starving people find it hard to flourish. Flourishing, then, isn't a passing feeling or an emotional state. Flourishing is a condition that is created by the choices we make in the world we live in. Few people think of happiness in this way anymore. You see that it took me a couple of hundred words to break down what we mean by a flourishing life. Aristotle and the Greeks expressed this idea in a single word, eudaimonia. Isn't it interesting that we don't have any commonly used word or phrase for this idea in English? We find it hard even to say what it means to flourish, let alone to actually flourish. And maybe here, Zach, is a good place to make a quick point about the limitations and possibilities of language. When you write a word, say, swim, it represents an experience but isn't, of course, the experience itself. If we use words to describe the experience well, say, in a cold black lake, or on a warm blue beach, we gain a more precise idea of the particular experience. The obvious limitation of language, however, is that no matter how well we write, our words can only be clumsy approximations of life. Here we're talking about happiness, and we have a few different words we can use: meaning, purpose, joy, pleasure, but no set of words can fully capture something as simple, even, as rolling a piece of chocolate around on your tongue. One consequence of this is that these letters in general, and this description of happiness in particular, will never be as full or precise as your own life. There will always be something missing. At the same time, one of the great possibilities of language is that it can draw our attention to parts of life that we might not have noticed on our own. Ancient writers, both Western and Eastern, often wrote using analogies. They did this because of what an analogy offers: an angle. Analogies help us to consider things in a way that we might not have considered them before. This can be extraordinarily helpful, and when language is used in this way it seems not clumsy, but clever. No matter how useful the analogy, however, we always have to remember that an analogy offers an angle, not an answer. We have to live our answers. To say that someone is flourishing or not flourishing is different from saying that someone is good or bad. An ill old man, in pain and dying at home, might be dignified, just, and virtuous. Such a man might be an example of what it means to die well. He could be a perfect example of courage in the face of adversity, but it does not make sense to say that he is flourishing when he is dying. The difference is worth thinking about. We might want our children to emulate the old man's courage, but we would not want our children to be in his condition. And here we begin to see one of the critical differences between flourishing and being good. Flourishing is not a virtue, but a condition, not a character trait, but a result. We need virtue to flourish, but virtue isn't enough. To create a flourishing life, we need both virtue and the conditions in which virtue can flourish. If you ever need a reminder that life isn't fair, Walker, just visit some schools around the country. The other day, I visited a junior high school in North St. Louis, a poorer part of my hometown. The whole time I was there, I didn't hear a single kind word from a teacher to a student. Or a single word of instruction. I heard a lot of yelling. I saw students who skulked through the halls and teachers who could reach them only through fear and threats. Those kids simply don't have the chances to flourish that I did. What could they have done with the education I got? What would I have become with the education they're getting? Good actions are not always rewarded. Good people suffer, and resilient people do not always flourish. Resilience is a virtue required for flourishing, but being resilient will not guarantee that we will flourish. Unfairness, injustice, and bad fortune will snuff out promising lives. Unasked for pain will still come our way. I say this not to discourage you, but to be honest with you. We can build resilience and shape the world we live in. We can't rebuild the world. Let's follow this strand of thought about the power of fortune for a minute. When you read the Iliad, the Odyssey, or even the Old Testament, you may notice one of the most striking differences between ancient and contemporary life: the amount of time and effort that people put into placating the gods or God. Think of the Greek army sacrificing oxen in the shadow of the Trojan walls. Odysseus tossed in stormy seas at the mercy of Poseidon, Abraham building altars to God in the desert with his own hands. With prayer and sacrifices, rituals and rules, people tried very hard to please the divine. Because they believed that their lives depended on it. This made a lot of sense. In the ancient world, survival and happiness hinged on what nature and agriculture provided. There is a healthy dose of realism that comes from life lived on the land, the kind of life you grew up with. The hunter masters his skills, yet still loves a stroke of luck. The farmer learns that despite his best efforts, pests descend. Despite his most fervent hopes, the rains don't come, and when they do, they can come in a flood. Worse still, an evil man can reap a bounty while a good man, think of Job, can suffer torments. People who live close to the land tend to harbor a sense of realism about the role of luck in their lives. Reynolds Price, a novelist and one of my college teachers, put it well: scratch a farmer and find the tragic sense of life. You can't convince a farmer that life is just one big Coors beer bash. They live according to the laws of sun, ice, and water. But those who are cut off from the land, except as a place to relax and recreate, are often afflicted with urban idealism. More and more people today live in a world of streets and houses and buildings and stadiums and schools. Stores and shop provide their food. All of these have been built by man, and it can lead us to an unnatural conclusion, even if we are unaware of it, that man has the potential to create a paradise. Human beings have produced wonders. We've cured diseases and reduced hunger, charted outer space, expanded the prospects for long and joyous lives. Were we to return to ancient Greece with all of our technology, we would indeed seem godlike. But we are not gods, and fortune is not ours to direct. Idealists forget this, and they are more easily ambushed by life. Realists remember this, and realism often accompanies resilience. Fortune will play her hand. And when she stands between us and flourishing, all we can do is live our best life. One of the reasons why so much of the wisdom about resilience is in fact ancient wisdom is that it comes from a time when human beings put less stock in their power to control the world. And that's why it's still valuable to us at those times, and there are many, when events seem beyond our power to control. Think about all the different ways that you're happy. You have the happiness of eating good ice cream, the happiness of a dinner with old friends, the happiness of a walk in the woods, the happiness of a hard-won victory, the happiness of a prayer that brings you peace. If we imagine a Mayan farmer, an ancient Burmese bricklayer, an Egyptian scribe, a Roman chef, a Spanish monk of the Middle Ages, and a modern American mechanic, we begin to see the wildly diverse beauty that exists in human life. There are many different ways to live, and even in the span of a single life, many different kinds of happiness. Given how varied and beautifully diverse human life is, we could say that there are as many kinds of happiness as there are colors, an infinite palette of joy that colors our world. In fact, thinking about color can lead us to a good analogy for happiness. The human eye can perceive millions of colors. Yet we know that we can create this wide range of colors largely from just three primary colors: red, yellow, and blue. In the same way that an infinite variety of colors can be created from three primary ones, we can think about the full range of happiness by looking at three primary kinds of happiness: the happiness of pleasure, the happiness of grace, and the happiness of excellence. I think it's fair to say that people who are flourishing usually have all three kinds of happiness in their lives. Let's consider them one at a time. The happiness of pleasure is easy to understand and easy to experience. We find it in a plate of good food, in a crackling fire, in a sound night's sleep under a sturdy roof. Just as the primary colors have many shades, the intensity of our happiness can be heightened or dampened depending, for example, on the quality of the food we eat or the softness of our bed. The happiness of pleasure is also shaped by our condition and our context. You never had to go to survival, evasion, resistance, and escape school. I don't know how you managed that, but I remember my week in Sear well. You get dropped in the woods as if you're behind enemy lines. For us it was in the scrub desert mountains in winter, and you have to evade capture. Then, when you do get captured, they put you in a POW camp. I know what you're thinking. How'd you get captured, G? Well, everyone has to get captured at some point. That whole week in Sear school, all I had to eat was half a carrot, half a cup of rice water, and an apple. But man, that apple was good. That was the sweetest, most satisfying, most succulent apple I've ever had. I loved that apple. I think that apple might have even loved me, it was so good. And I ate all of it. All of it except the stem and maybe a few of the seeds. Even the core was precious. The happiness I took from that apple during a week of starvation was completely different from the happiness of the apple I might have tonight after dinner. Some people, especially philosophers who get wrapped up in the life of the mind, have a tendency to deny or degrade the value of this kind of happiness. They refer to such pleasures as animal or base, or low, and they consider other kinds of happiness to be of a higher value. One philosopher to argue for this view was John Stuart Mill. He believed in higher and lower pleasures. Here's the most famous thing he said about pleasure: it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool, or the pig, are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. Now, Mill was undeniably a genius. He was raised to be a genius, subjected to a rigorous program of education designed by his father. It was so intense, in fact, that he had a nervous breakdown when he was 20 years old. Yet here, I think, you begin to see part of Mill's blindness. So much of his training, his suffering, and his pleasure was rooted in the mind that he failed to understand the life of the body or to appreciate the value of pleasure. Those who deny that pleasure is real happiness have probably never gone a few days without food or weeks without warmth. Much of the world goes without the material things we take for granted: a bed to sleep in, a roof to sleep under, suitable clothes to wear, and while we might call a roof a necessity and candy a luxury, both provide real pleasure. Let me share one story to explain why I think this way. I was in India. It was night, and I'd been riding the overnight train to Bombay in the cheap seats. I'd often buy bread when I traveled, and that trip I had a loaf of bread with me that I hadn't eaten. I stepped off the train amid the hot, exhausted rush of hundreds of other human beings and saw a kid, maybe he was 10, lying under a blanket in the station. The children who lived on the streets of Indian cities were some of the hungriest I'd seen. The boy was half asleep. I walk over to him and gently tap his shoulder with the brown bag. He barely opens his eyes, and it seems as if he's thinking, "Who's this white guy waking me up? Crazy dream." And then he realizes I'm handing him the bag, and he takes it in his hands and can feel that it's bread. He looks in the bag, and his mouth opens wide, and he's looking at me with wild, happy surprise. Mill can call that whatever he wants, but it's happiness. Real happiness. And it's just as good and real as the happiness of hard thinking. Walker, the second kind of happiness is harder for me to wrap language around. I'm calling it the happiness of grace, but your pastor might throw a fit because of the different meanings people ascribe to the word grace. Without getting into the theological details, grace is often considered to be a free gift from God that comes to us even though we haven't earned it. And there is a happiness that comes to human beings when we are grateful for the gifts we have received. You might also call this the happiness of gratitude. Think of the sense of joy and peace that comes over us when we pause, even for a moment, and genuinely say thank you. We may experience this kind of happiness in prayer, reflection, or meditation. Some people experience it on long walks. Others experience it when they see their children smile or when they see their spouse soundly asleep. This sort of happiness is often associated with a religious experience, but it usually happens outside the context of organized religious life. In order to say thank you, we have to thank someone or something. This means that we have, at least at that moment, some kind of relationship that is larger than ourselves. When we say thank you, we acknowledge a rightness in the world. The whole world might not be right, but we are thankful for at least one thing that seems fitting. In every civilization we find evidence that human beings have long sought and long enjoyed the happiness of grace, the sense that there is an order to the cosmos, an awareness of the gift of life, and an appreciation for our own place in it. Seneca wrote beautifully about this feeling, the awe at looking up and realizing that the universe, as huge and complicated as it is, somehow works. Maybe you felt it deep in the woods or floating in your kayak on the sea. This swift revolution of the heavens, being ruled by eternal law, goes on unhindered, producing so many things on land and sea, so many brilliant lights in the sky all shining in fixed array, even the phenomena which seem irregular and undetermined, I mean showers and clouds, the stroke of crashing thunderbolts and the fires that belch from the riven peaks of mountains, tremors of the quaking ground, these, no matter how suddenly they occur, do not happen without a reason. Walker, you told me that some of your happiest kid memories were of diving for abalone. Most abalone divers in California put on a fancy wetsuit first. But not you, you dive off a rock in your Levi's, kick until you were 15 or 20 feet under, pry the abalone off the seabed, and thrash your way back to the surface on a single breath. Then you'd do it again. And each time, you'd push yourself to dive deeper, hold your breath longer, bring back more. This is the kind of thing that regularly gets people killed, and you were doing it in jeans. I have one question for you, what the hell were you doing? If you'd needed food, you could have gone to the store. But, of course, you weren't doing it for food. You were doing it because it made you happy. Because you understood what Aristotle understood, pushing ourselves to grow, to get better, to dive deeper is at the heart of happiness. This is why kids climb trees, and why it's often a mistake when people yell at them to get down. This is the happiness that goes hand in hand with excellence, with pursuing worthy goals, with growing in mastery. And what's key here, Walker, is that you were happy while you were diving. It is about the exercise of powers. The most common mistake people make in thinking about the happiness of excellence is to focus on moments of achievement. They imagine the mountain climber on the summit. That's part of the happiness of excellence, and a very real part. What counts more, though, is not the happiness of being there, but the happiness of getting there. A mountain climber heads for the summit, and joy meets her along the way. You head for the bottom of the ocean, and joy meets you on the way. To be more precise, you create joy along the way. Some psychologists, like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, talk about the concept of flow, the kind of happiness that comes when we lose ourselves through complete absorption in a rewarding task. These periods of struggling to overcome challenges are what people find to be the most enjoyable times of their lives. A person who has achieved control over psychic energy and has invested it in consciously chosen goals cannot help but grow into a more complex being. By stretching skills, by reaching toward higher challenges, such a person becomes an increasingly extraordinary individual. These moments of immersion, of engagement, of clear focus, moments that can last for hours, occasionally days, are some of the best times of our lives. I want to be clear about this point. Pursuing excellence, stretching and straining our minds, bodies, and spirits, isn't like eating your vegetables. I'm not talking about this pursuit because it's good for you. I'm talking about it because it's joyful for you. Let me quote one other bit about the idea of flow, from the psychologist who first popularized the term. Contrary to what we usually believe, moments like these, the best moments in our lives, are not the passive, receptive, relaxing times. The best moments usually occur when a person's body or mind is stretched to its limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile. You already know this. In your moments of growth, you feel fully present, fully alive. You know those times when you look up and think, it's been 8 hours. When you're pushing yourself, absorbed, lost in time, that's happiness. It's the happiness that resilience helps us to achieve. Joy, like sweat, is usually a byproduct of your activity, not your aim. Remember what comes first. A focus on happiness will not lead to excellence. A focus on excellence will, over time, lead to happiness. The pursuit of excellence leads to growth, mastery, and achievement. None of these are sufficient for happiness, yet all of them are necessary. The happiness of excellence comes from deep engagement with the world. And when we're engaged in service to others, we find that this happiness takes on a whole new dimension, meaning. It's one pleasure to dive for abalone. It's another pleasure to dine for abalone to feed a hungry family. My grandmother-in-law knots. She's great at it, and I know that trying to master new patterns and products gives her pleasure. I also know that knitting for a friend in hospice or for her great-grandchildren provides her a deeper satisfaction that comes with doing work that's meaningful. And that combination, outer service and inner growth, is one of the most beautiful things we can create in a good life. We can push that analogy between happiness and the colors a bit further. If you lose one of the primary colors, you lose a big part of the color spectrum. If you lose yellow, you also lose every shade of green. In the same way, our lives lose something without all three kinds of happiness. Those who do not have worthy struggles in their lives never enjoy the pleasure of celebrating a hard-won victory. They don't know the satisfaction that comes from growth, or the happiness of friendships formed when people help each other in hard times. We can all think of people, whether they're people we've been lucky to know or people we know from history, who made great sacrifices in their search for a purpose, because they knew that their lives wouldn't be complete without one. One of those people was Hannah Senesh. When she left her native Hungary to emigrate to Palestine, she wrote in her diary, "I've become a different person, and it's a very good feeling. One needs something to believe in, something for which one can have wholehearted enthusiasm. One needs to feel that one's life has meaning, that one is needed in this world." She lived by those words. A few years later, at the age of 23, she volunteered to parachute into a war zone, sneak behind Nazi lines, and rescue Hungarian Jews on the verge of being sent to Auschwitz. She became a symbol of heroism and purpose to those who came after her and learned her story. I was one of them. I learned about Hannah Senesh as a kid in Sunday school, and as you can see, her story stuck with me. The lesson I take from her is that the pull of purpose, the desire to feel needed in this world, however we fulfill that desire, is a very powerful force in a human life. You don't have to die in pursuit of excellence, Walker. We all want you around for a while. But you do have to recognize that the drive to live well and purposefully isn't some grim, ugly, teeth-gritting duty. On the contrary, it's a very good feeling. It really is happiness. Lots and lots of red will never make blue. In the same way, because physical pleasure is fundamentally different from the pursuit of excellence, the happiness of pleasure can never replace the happiness that comes from the pursuit of excellence. But people still try. When people lose the pursuit of something worthy, they often try to replace that pursuit with some kind of pleasure. We can pursue pleasures all we like. But having a lot of the wrong thing doesn't make it the right thing. Pleasures can never make up for an absence of purposeful work and meaningful relationships. Pleasures will never make you whole. Some veterans come home from war and turn to alcohol or drugs. You've been there, and thousands have been there before you. Why is it that the toughest people we know, people who went without a soft bed, a home-cooked meal, and comfortable clothes for months at a time, suddenly can't go a day without a bottle? A lot of people think veterans turn to drink and drugs to forget what they experienced in war, and some do. But that's only a partial and distorted truth. More often, veterans turn to drink and drugs to replace what they experienced in war. A veteran who comes home from war is returning from one of the most intense experiences a human being can have. Even if he was not under fire every day, he woke up every morning as part of a team. He started every day with a purpose, and a mission that mattered to those around him. Even in the middle of the desert, when it's 100 degrees at 10 a.m. and your nostrils are full of sand, there's happiness. Real happiness. It comes from working together, hurting together, fighting together, surviving together, mourning together. It is the essence of the happiness of excellence. The conditions might be miserable, the larger mission might be misguided, but purpose is usually clear every day, even if it is only to bring your friends home with honor. I have always had a preference for Spartan living, and in the military the simplicity of your environment matches the clarity of your purpose. When I was in Iraq, we knew that our work was saving the lives of American Marines. We woke up every day to live a life that mattered. When you come home from war, all of that, the adrenaline, the love, the purpose, the pursuit, the nobility, the calling, vanishes. The happiness of excellence, of purposeful endeavor, is gone. At the same time, you're laboring in an environment with few pleasures. So you reach for a beer. You indulge in a meal. You make love. The first night at home, this is all good. Life is good. Life is very, very good. But if you've been home for a year, and you are still drinking hard every night, then you have a problem. And the problem, truth be told, isn't what happened in the war. The problem now is what you've decided to make your life since you've been home. Alcohol and drugs can soothe us, but only temporarily. TV and video games can distract us, but they can't trick us into thinking we've found meaning. You've lived this, Zach. People all around you are living the same thing every day on their own front lines. Athletes who leave the game because of injury or the natural decay of their skills are living it. People who lose their jobs are living it. Workers who retire and can't think of how to fill their days are living it. Elderly people who outlive the friends are living it. What the hell, they all wonder, am I here for now? But there is no purpose to be found at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. The happiness if pleasure can't provide purpose, it can't substitute for the happiness of excellence. The challenge for the veteran, and for anyone suddenly deprived of purpose, is not simply to overcome trauma, but to rebuild meaning. The only way out is through suffering to strength. Through hardship to healing. And the longer we wait, the less life we have to live. There is happiness in struggle. I ran my first marathon when I was 16, and I came to love the fun and the struggle of long-distance running. 15 years and many faces later, I set a goal to run a 3-hour marathon. I bought the right shoes, ate all the right foods, did all the right training with some very fast friends. I even picked a fast course with the perfect conditions, Arizona in January. I went to sleep every night for months thinking of the date circled on my calendar. I crossed the finish line in 3 hours and 12 seconds. That sucked. I decided to try one more time. And I decided that if I was going to break through the 3-hour wall, I needed to do something harder, maybe a little crazy. I could just take the time. I'd have to earn it. I'd been reading about Emil Zatopek, one of the greatest runners of all time, and one of the most intense. The training run I copied from his regimen was the 80 by 400. He would run 80 times around a 400-meter track, with a 60-second rest between each lap. And he'd run each lap at a sprint. I have no idea what the physiological value of that training was. I'm not sure if my body changed. But my mind did. I discovered I could run faster and harder than I thought I could, faster and harder than I had in Arizona. And when the next marathon came, I thought about Emil Zatopek, pushed a little harder, and broke through that wall. I like Zatopek because he's a great example of resilience and happiness working in tandem. Emil Zatopek did not set out to be a runner. He was forced into his first race in 1940, at the age of 18, by a coach at the Czech shoe factory where he worked. Somewhere before the finish line of that first race, he discovered that he wanted to win more than anything. But I only came in second, Zatopek later remembered. That was the way it started. His life had a direction. Soon he was training insanely hard, developing a regimen and a running style all his own. Where other runners paced themselves in training, he sprinted. He ran in the snow and in his army boots, so that running 10,000 meters in clear conditions in track shoes felt like a relief by comparison. Within 4 years, Zatopek was setting Czech records, then world records. Asked the secret of his success, he responded, simple. I run, and run, and run. In the 1952 Olympics, after winning gold in the 5,000 and 10,000 meter races, Zatopek decided on a whim to run his first marathon. His strategy: find the fastest runner and keep pace with him. With a third of the race done, Zatopek turned to his closest competitor at the head of the pack and asked if he was running at the right pace. The leader replied, too slow, hoping to trick the Czech into exhausting himself. Instead, Zatopek sped up, and crossed the finish line with a world record. Emil Zatopek was never a graceful runner. His head lolled from side to side as he ran, and his breaths came in gasps so loud his competitors could hear him coming. He wore all the pain of running on his face. You can imagine him in sight of the finish, pain clawing through his thighs, the rhythm of his heart pounding in his ears, his lungs on fire. That's very real pain. And a very real pleasure. It's a purpose and a happiness only possible with resilience. When we rob people of their pain, when we don't allow them the possibility of failure, we also rob them of their happiness. We are meant to have worthy work to do. If we aren't allowed to struggle for something worthwhile, we'll never grow in resilience, and we'll never experience complete happiness. It's natural to ask, if we need all three kinds of happiness, why do we see and hear so much about the happiness of pleasure and so little about the happiness of grace and the happiness of excellence? Today we are sold to at a frequency and intensity unmatched in history. On television and radio, the sides of buses, flyers on our cars, entire sides of buildings, billboards, mailings, targeted ads in our inboxes, there are fewer moments than ever before when our senses are not bombarded by advertising. Think of the happiness of pleasure from the perspective of someone responsible for those ads. Happiness is attainable, anyone can buy it. And those ads offer a vision of happiness that's relatable, you're so close, and vivid, it'll feel so good. But pleasure has its limits. There comes a point of excess, a point of exhaustion. And the constant pursuit of pleasure can actually distract us from enjoying what we already have. Epicurus, maybe the greatest philosopher of pleasure, understood this. Not what we have, but what we enjoy, constitutes our abundance. The constant promise of pleasure can blind us to the fact that there are other kinds of happiness that we need for a full life. We begin to believe that one more purchase, one more meal, one more trip, one more thing will finally make us complete. Why sell something no one can buy? The happiness that comes from the pursuit of excellence cannot be advertised, because it is not for sale. It is unsellable because we create it, or not, for ourselves. Constantly pursuing pleasure puts too many lives out of whack. Look at all the shades of red I have. People say, I have auburn and burgundy and cardinal and crimson and maroon and raspberry and rose and rust and you may be blind to everything else. Excellence and grace are often missing from the stunted version of happiness people want to sell us. Finally, Walker, it's important to remember that all the talk about colors is only an analogy, and every analogy has its limitations. Where on the color wheel are your friends, your kids, your wife, your parents? They are, of course, in everything. But you and I know it would be false to say only that our kids make us more grateful, that your friends make us more excellent, or that some of the people in our lives make it more pleasurable. It's true that they do these things, but there's a happiness in our relationships that is deeper, wider, and more profound than anything we've touched on here. We can talk more about relationships and resilience later. For now, I just want to make the point that these letters will have their limitations. Maybe the most important is our inability to adequately express or theorize how crucial love is to happiness.